Hello and welcome to UMD IMD's first tutorial on Reaper, an acronym that stands for Rapid Environment for Audio Production, Engineering, and Recording. More simply put, it is a DAW, or DAW, Digital Audio Workstation. What that means is it is a software environment in which you can record, produce, mix, master, and do lots of other things with audio. And like all good software websites, their website has a download page, which you can go to and download for Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. Although Reaper is free to start out, it does give you a 60-day trial, though that 60-day trial is sort of a soft limit. After 60 days, on this menu that tends to pop up when you open up the application, you will see a button here that is grayed out. And that button will have a countdown from 5, and once the countdown is over, you'll be able to close it. Now, of course, Reaper is supported by a strong community, so it is great to purchase your own license. It's a lot cheaper than proprietary software, and so I'm saying this with no direct affiliation with the Reaper community. So I'm just going to close that, and we will do a brief tour of the environment. One thing to do before you do anything in Reaper is to make sure your input and output settings are properly adjusted. So go to Options, Preferences, and on the left-hand side, you'll see a list of items, and sort of near the top, under Audio, you have this Device section. Click on that. Your audio system may vary based on your default audio setup, but I have selected Wave Out because that is what works best on my system. And then you have your input device, which is how you will be taking audio in. So if you're on a laptop, for example, that may just be coming through your default microphone. But I'm using outside hardware that is plugged in through the Thunderbolt port. So mine is Microphone Universal Audio Thunderbolt. And then your output device is going to be your speakers or headphones, most likely. I also am using an outside hardware device, so I can switch that over to speakers, Universal Audio Thunderbolt. But do note, if you have your speakers selected in your output device here, and then you plug in your headphones, you'll want to open up your preferences again and switch your output device to headphones. Otherwise, your volume settings may not work or may still continue to come out of the speakers or may just be muted. You may have to hit apply, and then I'll hit OK, and then we can get started. Now, if you're familiar with other DAWs, maybe you've used GarageBand if you are a Mac user, this layout may look fairly similar, though it may look a lot more complicated. But it's really not. Over here, you have your workspace where you can edit clips of audio. Down here, you have your Docker, which will give you access to adjust things like volume and panning on your audio tracks. And up here, you have a space to create new tracks, and it works similar to the space down here in the Docker, but we'll get to that soon enough. So if I'd like to create a new track to hold some audio, I simply have to double-click in this dark gray area over here, and it will add a track to the end of this list. So if I keep clicking, it's going to keep adding more tracks. And each track can hold an individual recording, an individual instrument, a software instrument, or even just effects. And I'll go ahead and delete those tracks to demonstrate that it is also possible to pull in your own audio files and just drop them in this area, and they will populate your workspace. And just one note, because your interface may look different, if you go to Options, Themes, I'm using the default theme. Now we can break down this track view from left to right, starting with this red circular icon. That is the record arm disarm button. So if this is selected, then that track is able to record. That is for when you are recording either MIDI or from a microphone or a line in. Because I'm not going to be doing that today, I'm going to deselect it just to keep things clean. Next up, you have your track name, which is pretty straightforward. It is what you want to name your track. So to stay organized, it's always helpful to name your track whatever it's going to be holding, whether that's an effect or an instrument or a vocal. You just double click and you name it there. Next, we have the volume knob, which of course raises and lowers the volume. And you'll notice as I'm raising and lowering the volume here, the slider down here in the Docker is moving with it. So if I move this slider down in the Docker, then it moves the knob up here. These are directly linked, just as all of the buttons we'll be going over are. The Docker just gives you a different way of looking at your mixing tools, and it looks a lot more similar to a mixing board, which is what you would use in real life. Next up, we have Route. Route can move your audio track to other tracks. I won't get into that right now because it's a bit more advanced, but we'll come back around to that at another time. Onward, we have the FX button. When clicked, this will bring up a big list of all of the effects and software instruments you might have loaded into Reaper. Reaper can load in plugins. There are plenty of open source ones. There are plenty of proprietary ones. But your plugins are really what fuels your audio recording. Whether you're mixing or producing, you will likely be touching some sort of effects plugin. And that's how you access it. Next up, we have the Track Envelopes and Automation button. That opens up another window, which allows you to check different boxes for envelopes you might want to affect dynamically. And as the word envelope implies, your envelope is containing your audio in some form. So this will vary based on the effect you are using with your audio track, but we can do things such as volume or pan to raise and lower that volume. So if I click this, it's going to bring up a colored area underneath my track along with a line. And that line is going to show how your envelope is acting in your timeline. So if, for example, I want the audio on my track to fade in gradually, if I Control or Command click on the line, it's going to create a node, and there's already a node at the beginning that happens by default. And so if I drag down this node, you'll see that we now have a gradual ramp up to our maximum volume. And our audio track, if I play it, is gradually ramping up the volume till we hit our natural level. So this allows you to play dynamically with your track, whether that's volume or panning or any sort of effect or even part of an effect. You can access that through this trim button and by checking whatever effect you are trying to affect. Next up is the pan knob. And just as the volume knob corresponds directly to the Docker section, so too does the pan knob. So you can see it is shifting as I twist it. And pan allows you to direct more or less audio into one speaker or the other. So it allows you to direct specific audio tracks toward your listener's right or left ear, giving you what's known as a stereo mix. And that can be very useful in a lot of ways. It can create spatialized effects. It can help you clean up your mix so you can separate similar sounding audio tracks into different ears in order to better highlight them. And unless it's mixed in mono, any decent musical recording will play in some way with panning. Next up, we have our recording input selector. So whenever you're recording, whether that is through a microphone or through MIDI, you can select where that sound source is coming from through here. We won't get into that either. And along with that, we can select what channel our input is coming from, whether that is left or right, or stereo, or from some sort of MIDI device. Finally, over here, we have our meter, which indicates how loud our track is in real time. You've probably seen this at some point in your life, whether that's through a stereo system or some sort of behind-the-scenes video of an artist recording. And then we have our mute button, which will, of course, mute our track. And then we have our solo button, which isn't going to do anything when I only have one track, but if you have multiple tracks, then we would only be hearing this one track that's solo. You can also solo multiple tracks if needed. Finally, we have our phase button, which is also another topic I will not get into in this tutorial. And again, you have your mute, solo, and meter indicated down here in the Docker. Lastly, we have what is called our transport right here above the Docker. And this gives you playback control. how your audio is playing in real time. And so it's all fairly intuitive if you have ever used any sort of audio program. You've got your skip forward or skip back. This will go to the start or end of your project. You've got your record button. This allows you to record, and remember, your track needs to be armed here if you're going to be recording through that track. Your play button, which of course plays. Your repeat button, which will loop your audio either by the selection. If you click and drag up here, it will loop in that area. Or if nothing is selected, it will loop once it hits the end of your audio track. Then, of course, we have our stop button and our pause button. Measures and time are indicated here. You can see that there's this grid. That grid is breaking up our project into meters, and those meters and the distance between that grid is based off of our BPM here. So if I lowered the BPM, you're going to shift that grid, which indicates that your song is going to be playing slower. BPM stands for beats per minute. Over here we have our time signature for those of you who are familiar with musical notation. You can adjust that if needed. And then over here, depending on what is selected, when again I drag up at the top here, this will indicate what our start, end, and length of that selection is. Then we have this global automation override, which gives us control over all of our automation, if you have it in your project. And finally, we have a playback rate, which will make your track sound like it's being sped up or slowed down on a tape player. And one last thing to note, this right here is our playhead. It indicates where we are in our song, and you can hover across the top here and drag it to allow you to scrub and hear your audio track. And like the playback rate, it sounds like you're scrubbing through a reel-to-reel tape. And so that's your general overview tutorial. Next tutorial, we will go over how to edit audio clips. Thank you.